celebrating success, learning from legends, and growing poppies. This is Tall Poppy Talk with Grace Lewis. Kia ora and welcome to Tall Poppy Talk. Today we have Angelique Richardson, going by Ange. She is, and I quote, one of the UK's leading sports lawyers. This year she was named in the first cohort of the International Sports Convention 30 Under 30 Awards, recognising her exceptional talent and dedication to not only the sports industry, but the media and entertainment industries also. As an associate in the sports and entertainment team at Lauren Stevens, she represents a number of professional athletes on high-profile boxing, promotional agreements, anti-doping disputes, and multi-million-pound arbitrations. Having been an elite athlete herself, competing in synchronized swimming and fin swimming, Ange can represent athletes in the top levels of international professional sport with not only like this legal mind, but a much more holistic one. She's taking pride in advising her clients in relation to their reputation, their management, strategy, and also just career development outside of sport as well. And hence why Ange got appointed to the Sports Resolutions Pro Bono service, which, in a very succinct description, is where she can help make a positive impact at all levels by servicing athletes of limited financial means. And the topic of reputation and identity is one that Ange and I have actually had the pleasure of discussing over coffee in London already, but I am so excited and grateful that she's going to be on the podcast today because this is an area that we really haven't delved into before. So, and my first question is, where and how are you today?
I'm really good, thank you. I'm good. I'm sat in my little flat in London, and it's pouring down with rain outside,
What's new?
which is a bit miserable for April, I'm not gonna lie. But yeah, I'm really well, thank you. How are you?
I'm really well too, thank you. Like
Good.
I said, we did have this big conversation already in London because
Yeah.
shout out to Stu, our networks and paths crossed. And as we were talking, I think you actually brought up first, which I was so grateful for, of like, oh, the podcast, that sounds interesting. And I'm like, yes, cool. I didn't want to
The elephant in the room.
I really wanted to ask you, and I didn't know if that was too much.
Uh-huh.
But that's why this first question I have, just to get into it,
Yeah.
and it's one of my favorite ones for someone who has a career like yours, in the sense that we kind of all hear about lawyers and maybe sports lawyers, and we have this idea of what that means. But my first question is, what do people think you do, and what do you really do as a sports and entertainment lawyer?
It's a good question. People often think that my job is all glam. They'll primarily see that I'm like backstage at events, rubbing shoulders with athletes, with talent, with stakeholders, etc., or just negotiating and, getting over the line, these big money, high profile deals. But the reality is a lot more complex. There are those like super exciting moments, which, I'm so grateful to be able to experience on a very regular basis. But most of my work happens quietly behind the scenes, whether that's advising athletes on contracts, handling disputes, navigating various regulations and staying up to date with those, managing a crisis more often than not. But most importantly, sort of protecting my clients and their reputations. And I think a huge part of my role is risk management and just making sure that my clients' careers are safeguarded in the long term, not just like chasing headlines, I guess. So very exciting and glam to the outsider, but they don't see the 70 plus hour working weeks.
Thank you, because that is especially becoming more common with social media, etc. But just in general of, oh, cool, like Ange is at this big boxing match or she's at some big event here, but there's a reason you're there. And also worth calling out, because I found this so interesting in our conversation, was typically like the athletes you're working with, we're not talking like a big Premier football team where there's a huge roster. You're working more directly with individual athletes.
Yeah, so predominantly I'd say 80% of my work at the moment is boxing, and that'll be working with, the individual fighters. But across the team, my colleagues work in football, golf, motorsport, but as a team collectively, we kind of have the same vision in, wanting to protect athletes and their rights, and we'll primarily work with the athlete directly, and or talent if it's in the entertainment space.
So fascinating. And I think this whole area is something that like the layperson or me, or like I was an athlete, you were an athlete,
Yeah,
we're becoming more aware of rights that there are, and especially being like a female
absolutely.
athlete, or me in rowing, like that's typically not been a very high revenue sport. But in the States right now, they had a hearing yesterday, and it's going to be extended till next week with the whole name, image, and likeness
Yeah.
about now colleges are going to be able to have like $20 million salary caps to pay like it's completely changing the approach to that quote marks amateur sport.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so that's going to generate a completely new conversation, which will no doubt impact you and
Hmm.
how you deal with athletes, if they're American, whatever, or you have
Yeah.
British, UK athletes wanting to go over to the States to compete in college. And now that's no longer an amateur, that's actually professional. So there's all of that.
100%. Yeah, and absolutely. And I think, one of the things that, I tell my clients very early on is, your reputation is your biggest asset, and it's your image. You need to protect your image. And, as you get higher up in boxing in the rankings, and, you attract more commercial deals, the value of your image, skyrockets. So it is the most important thing.
So I can't actually imagine though how unusual that must be if you are an athlete and you have someone like you who's been doing this for some time, you really know the ropes, saying like, yeah, your image, your face. Right now you might just think it's your face, but soon even your rights to it, you're signing off to someone else. Like that concept has got to be really difficult to, I guess, bed in the younger athletes'
Yeah,
brains.
absolutely. Yeah, 100%. Because they don't quite get that, your image is, a thing that you can profit from. I know with, the rise of TikTok and social media and Instagram, and, you've got, influencer life. I think the younger generation is sort of clocking onto it a lot earlier. But definitely I'd say, athletes who are just starting to turn pro, they don't quite sort of understand like the nuances around it. So, there's a conversation to be had legally, but what that means in practice, it sounds a lot different. So it's really kind of just making sure that they've got that education, because then it'll all come into how athletes will make their money and what their, taxes look like, and all that kind of thing. So it can get really complicated, but I think if you are working with an athlete or the talent from a really young age, or just as they're about to turn professional, that's kind of the time when you kind of need to advise them of that particular point, and how they can take advantage of it
And
before somebody else does.
yeah, and I guess like a way we probably interact with it all the time that we don't even recognize is you think Formula One or even golfers, like if they win, they're putting on that baseball cap that has the
Yes,
sponsor,
exactly. Yeah,
because that sponsor has paid a significant amount of money
exactly.
for that image and in that
Yeah.
moment. And so now, if people are listening, they're probably going to notice that when they're watching
Uh-huh.
sports. And even, like I said, down to the more entry amateur levels, I think our school was Adidas, so we couldn't wear
Hmm.
Nike. And like
Hmm.
sometimes, though, you just have a preference because you like the Nike shoes more, they fit. But when we would go to competition, we would have to swap out and be
Exactly.
wearing Adidas.
Yeah. Uh-huh. And making the athlete aware of the risks to that. Like they just think I can just go out in the street and wear any brand I want. But actually, if you are in contract with a huge brand, and you've got stipulations in that contract that ensure that you wear that particular brand, if you're out and about in public, like then it could be an issue. Like luckily we are able to have very commercial conversations with these brands and sponsors, work very commercially, and we've got very good working relationships with them. So we never really get into like huge disputes or litigation around that kind of thing. It's way less costly just to pick up the phone to the other side, But we have had a couple of instances where some brands have really, pardon the pun, like kicked off. And it has been a massive issue that the athlete has had to deal with.
Well, you and I had spoken previously about like, yes, you have these elite athletes who know the game, they know the ropes,
Yeah.
much like how you start to know about the niche of the sport you're dealing with.
Yes. Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
being in that environment, you start to pick up on things. I think when you're in the early stages, you're so eager to get something that you just say yes without necessarily, if you don't have the benefit or the, wits to get a lawyer like you, you do sign things because you're like,
Absolutely.
I'm going to get money, absolutely, and you don't recognize what you're signing away and restricting
Exactly.
yourself.
Yeah, or even, the funds to even pay for a lawyer, because, we're not cheap. But I think you've cracked it there. Like, it's really sad to see, and I'll just talk about boxing, because that's obviously the sport that I've got the most experience in at the moment. It's really sad to see, fighters come up to me and say, "Ange, signed this, I didn't take legal advice, couldn't afford it at the time, just got some random solicitor to take a look at it, who obviously isn't qualified in sports law. Thought I'd be fine, but now I've got this issue with my promoter or my manager, and I need to find a resolution." And I kind of take a look at this contract, and it's often, very much in the promoter or the manager's favour. And I kind of have to say to them, look, you're in a very sticky situation, but I will always do my best to, try and find a creative way to help them. But that's kind of why I like to speak to athletes when they're just about to turn professional. Like, they've just come back from the Olympics and they're kind of thinking, do I want to turn pro? Do I not? That's kind of the time where you can kind of really say to them, look, like, if you are going to turn professional and you're looking to sign a contract with a promoter that's going to last at least like 2 to 3 years, get some legal advice. It might not be me, it might not be my team, but just make sure you've got a qualified lawyer who has a little bit of experience in boxing and the nuances of the sport to really advise you and just to make sure you're as protected as you can be. But you're totally right, turning professional in boxing and being offered a promotional contract is like gold dust. And you've got these young fighters who just want to sign straight away and get fighting and make loads of money. But at the same time, there are a lot of traps in those promotion contracts. And don't get me wrong, like, there are promoters out there and managers out there who do value their fighters, but ultimately they're a business and, they're always going to protect their business first. So that's kind of why we're there for them.
Definitely. And something that I guess we should touch upon that I had kind of skimmed over was why even law and sports entertainment law in particular, like what drove you to pursue that? Was it natural? Just talk me through that journey, please.
So I was kind of pushed into doing law. It's probably the polite way to say it. Sorry, Mum. I did generally have an interest in law, and I chose the topic for one of my A levels. But I'd always pictured myself doing something a little bit more creative, I think. But I'd say specialising in sports law, and entertainment was just something that evolved quite naturally. As you mentioned, I used to be an athlete myself, so I was kind of, I had that experience firsthand of, the pressures and, the gaps in athlete protection, that nearly all athletes face today. So I'm kind of in a very unique position, I guess, to advise them. And I didn't necessarily have a roadmap or anything like that. I made it quite clear early on in my career that sport was something that I had an interest in pursuing. And at that particular time, I was in a bigger, more corporate focused law firm. And then I ended up just meeting the right people at the right times, being introduced to the right people. It kind of all just fell into place when it should have done. So that's probably not very helpful, but I think what you kind of get out of that is, just put yourself out there and make sure you've got the right networks around you. And, if you work hard and, really graft, then you'll get to where you want to be.
I think that that's honestly really good advice, and it reminds me of a previous guest I had, Martin Toomey, and he's with the Winter Olympics in New Zealand,
Yeah.
and he mentioned that he always wanted to be an athlete, but he recognized that maybe his level or his longevity in the sport wouldn't be long, and so he started thinking, okay, how can I be in sport long term? Because
Yeah.
even if you're an incredible athlete in a sport like golf, which probably is one of the most old sport, like you can be kind of older in that
Yeah,
sport.
100%. Yeah, it's more sustainable.
Yes, but even then, like once you get in the late 30s, or like you're considered old in those
Yeah.
sports. So
Yeah.
he was like, okay, that's obviously not a very long-lived career. How can I remain in the sports world, be adjacent and immersed in it? He's like, I need to make myself indispensable in terms of like management, or be involved in sports management and teams. And it's the same way with you as a sports lawyer. you are going to be able, already like with boxing and then other sports that are going to come out, you become so immersed, and the more experience you get, more, and that'll make you even more indispensable because of, you know, the wisdom you share,
Yeah,
that you're going to go
I
through
hope so.
you'll go through so many generations of athlete careers.
Yes, yeah.
Because they just have shorter time, like career timelines are shorter for athletes, we know that. But sports law, like, you can do that for the long run, which is pretty exciting because you stay in that sports environment without necessarily being the athlete.
Yeah, 100%. But that is also quite good that you've picked up on that, because that's something that we kind of tap into with our clients. Because, you know, a fighter could go into the ring, they can make their debut, and they might not come out of the ring, or they might, you know, get knocked out and they're not allowed to fight ever again. You know, what happens then? So we kind of do say to our athletes across the board, like, you need to be thinking long term. What is going to happen when you can't fight anymore, you can't play football anymore? You need to think about, you know, ultimately your income and how you're going to survive, because we've seen some nightmares with some of our sort of older clients. But that's why it's really important for them to, you know, have really sound professional advisors around them, financial advisors, you know, just making sure that they're set up, you know, post retirement, post career.
Most definitely. Thank you for pointing that out, because even the legal part, but sometimes with athletes, you and I know, and people listening, is that has always been the goal. And in particular, I probably experienced it more in the States, where there were some people who could not cook. Not saying I'm a great cook, but they didn't know how to function outside of the sport because they had been in these environments where the egos were stroked or things were taken care of, their finances, because they were on scholarship. And then, especially with American football, there's not, unless you go NFL, there's no like sub leagues really to compete in. Like, you're kind of done after college, and then that's when you hear of, I don't actually know how to handle my finances. And I know that the tide's really changing on that conversation, but that's when I started to witness, like, oh, there needs to be, and this is what you say, a holistic approach to being that athlete, so that if and slash when that career ends, whether it's on your terms or not, you have other facets of your identity and income and stability, so that you aren't, the rug's not completely swept from underneath you.
100%. It's definitely about giving them that education. And, you know, I've got some athletes who, you know, are now very financially literate, for example. And, you know, after they, you know, stop doing the sport and they go and they retire, at least they know that they're set up because they've got like all of this passive income. I'm not an investment, like anything to do with investments, not me. Or I've got, you know, some athletes who really love punditry and commentary, and, you know, they're themselves starting to get, you know, opportunities with, you know, football clubs to do a little bit of punditry here and there. But then their online and sort of commercial presence will then grow that way. So actually, sometimes they might make more from that than they do from the sport itself, which is just crazy. So yeah, it's just really sort of making sure that, you know, that they are aware that they're not going to be, you know, at this level of fitness and be able to compete at this level forever. And it kind of shocks them a little bit, because they've been so focused on getting to one particular level, or, you know, turning professional, or, you know, becoming a world champion, that they kind of think, crap, what comes after this, you know? So it's kind of sort of just grounding them a little bit and saying, right, okay, this is great. You're doing amazing on, you know, this sort of work stream, but, you know, everything else needs to be working at the same time. So,
and I really feel like that actually feeds back into better performance, because if you are completely 100% the athlete identity, that's a lot of pressure, because like, if you only have one race or a couple races a year, or one fight, maybe 2 or 3 max in a year, and it hinges on a good performance and it doesn't go well, that just really increases that performance anxiety and pressure. Whereas when we think at like sports psychology, if you're able to have like other avenues and other streams where you can feel confidence or creative expression, or whether that's like, you know, actually work or a hobby, or just having good non-athlete friends, maybe, you know, like doing other activities, that will come back and actually make you a better athlete, because you don't have so much pressure on that one area.
Absolutely, yeah. You're not sort of expending, mental strength on other things that you should be focused on.
Yeah,
If that makes any sense at all, like you can just solely focus on the job because you know that everything else is taken care of to an extent.
yeah.
And yeah, when you're talking about your performance and for something that is as pressured as boxing, ultimately, like lives are at risk in that ring. It's super important.
And okay, so with boxing, obviously they need to, a big part of it is the entertainment, like they've got personalities because
Yeah.
part of like the pre-fight that we love is the smack talk, is this, because then you get invested and like you hardly ever really watch a boxing match and go like, I just want to see a good fight. You're like,
Uh-huh.
no, I'm really rooting for this person, but like you get an affiliation because of that personality. And I know a lot of
100%.
it could be theatrics, whatever it is. It's
Hmm.
part of the entertainment part of sport.
Yeah.
But in your role, because you are that person who's seeing them all the time, you are talking financial literacy, you're seeing them as that whole person. I would love to know what's a misconception people have about working with like high profile public facing athlete clients that you work with.
That's a really hard question because all of the clients that we work with are so different, I
Mm.
would say. We've got a lot of clients who are at very different levels, different sports, around different people. But I think one of the biggest misconceptions is probably that the clients, have got absolutely everything figured out. People will see you've got one particular client who is, a world champion. They must have their life totally together, but actually that's behind the scenes, that's really not the case. And, they think they've got a huge team handling every single detail of their life. But many of the clients that we work with are under that immense pressure and, don't always have the right advisors in place very early on. Even though they've got superhuman abilities, they are still human. They've got vulnerabilities, they've got uncertainties, instability, and they take a long time to trust. But, once that happens, they will trust you to help navigate them around, some very complex situations, whether that's, personal situations or professional. And I'd say with that, my role isn't just, being their lawyer. It is often personal, and I think it's about being a confidant as much as being a lawyer, I would say. So yeah, I would say that.
Thank you. That's such a great answer and insight because you do. You look at these athletes and you either praise them and say, oh my gosh, they're amazing, or for
Mhm.
some reason, you get the couch sideline being like, I would never have, hit the ball or done that, like critiquing. And
Uh-huh.
it's like, they really are people. This is an odd
Yeah.
example, but one that came to mind was, and I'll forget her name, but there was a tennis match recently with two female athletes, and one of them just started crying because she had a stalker who had there
Yes.
was a restraining
Yeah.
all that stuff, and she
I've read
saw
about that.
him. Right, she saw him in the crowd, and naturally, because she's a human, that completely unsettled her. She spiraled. She was
Uh-huh.
upset because
Hmm.
that person was in the crowd, and I feel like that was just a really public reminder of like, well, no, these are people, and yes, she's on this televised match right now, but she can't switch that off. Like, no one would be able to do that. That
100%.
was
Yeah.
so intense, wasn't it?
Uh-huh. And so scary as
So
well.
scary. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, that's just an extreme example, but then you think more about like, they can hear you if you're yelling things during a game or
Mhm.
just that humanness that you touched upon. They're doing superhuman things, but they are human and they might make a mistake or they don't have
Or
everything figured out.
they've had a bad day,
Yeah.
or, they've had an argument with somebody and, it's like totally just put them off the ball. I think a lot of people think, well, regardless, they should be able to lock in, but that isn't always the case. Like,
Yeah.
it just isn't. And I think it is about remembering that, everybody, they are human, they are just people. So yeah, that's what I tend to think about.
No, I love that. Thank you. And it made me think briefly too of athletes who went to the Tokyo Olympics versus Paris.
Yes. Hmm.
That whole conversation, because at Tokyo, of course, with COVID, there was no crowds. It was a very different experience. And a lot of athletes wanted to experience both, but they said like that contrast between the hype and the energy of Paris, where there was all these people spectating, versus when there wasn't. And not that one was I
Yeah.
mean, they all enjoyed Paris probably more because of that, but how even there where you go, what role then did the external play, did the crowds play and feed into that sports and entertainment side of the competition as well?
Absolutely, yeah, and it's quite funny that you mentioned that because I worked for Emily Campbell, who is a weightlifter, and she went to both Tokyo and Paris, medalled in both. Amazing, amazing woman. She had said similar, and I went to go see her in Paris, and her reaction after she did her last lift to the crowd who were like screaming for her is obviously going to be totally different to Tokyo. And I think it kind of just sort of hits you and you think, wow, like all of these people like shown up for me or, supporting me in some way, even if they're not affiliated with GB. But yeah, it's a totally different experience for sure.
Oh my. And with like you have someone like her who's obviously huge and then all the way down to like you said just maybe turning professional on the cusp or your pro bono,
Yeah.
a big thing we had spoken about which I loved was how do you like actually approach and work with clients to protect their personal brand?
I think that it starts with helping them sort of understand the power of their own narrative. Legally, I make sure that their contracts, align with their values and their long-term goals and factors like, what we discussed earlier, like their image is as protected as possible. But I also work with them, very proactively to help manage risk, whether that's reviewing, the sponsorship deals, handling media issues, or just advising them on, crisis communications. As I said earlier, your reputation is your biggest asset. And my job is to preserve that, especially when things might go off script. So, something might come in, a sponsorship deal that doesn't actually align with that particular client's views, in which case I'll say to them, is this something that you really want to go down? Because you told me when I first brought you on board that you only wanted to work in this particular sector or with brands that align with my values in this respect. And they kind of sort of just kind of forget about the money, the paycheck, and they just think, actually, what, Ange, you're right. In order to preserve, my identity and, my personal brand that I've been working for X many years to build and, get out there, I'll skip this one for now.
And preserving their brand, as I was like preparing for our conversation, I was
Yeah.
thinking too, like, how do you also preserve yours in terms of like, Ange, like you're behind the scenes, you're advocating, you're like navigating all your clients' identities.
Mm-hmm.
But in amongst that, you also have your own sense of self and identity. Like,
Yeah.
does that really come to your mind, or do you have time or capacity to also be like, okay, how am I doing? Like, what's my brand? Like, where do I fit in all of
Uh-huh.
this?
Yeah, that is such a good question because, I obviously prioritize my clients, so much. And then,
Yeah.
you know, a client could call me at like 3 o'clock in the morning and I'll answer the phone, which like saying that out loud is absolutely ridiculous, but that is, that's my job. My job is to protect them.
Yeah.
So like thinking about myself, it's just it's kind of it's an afterthought. It's secondary, which sounds so crazy because I'm always like one of those people that's like, what, you do you, look after number one. But in this like works like situation, like you just don't, I guess. But I think sort of reflecting on that, I guess it's easy to get lost in, constantly, protecting other people, championing other people. But for me, I think, I've just got to remember to stay grounded and, going out, doing, a couple of hours at Barry's or just taking like an hour, try and turn my phone off a little bit, does really help. But I always do go back to, why I started, working in this particular sector. And, it's about the impact. It's not really about like my own visibility. It's about, what can I do that can help protect, my athletes and my talent from those who want to take advantage of them. But there are times when I will step out of the shadows a little bit, whether it's, speaking at events or like mentoring, students or younger lawyers or, doing podcasts like this. It's rare, but it will happen. But I don't know, like it allows me to reflect on my journey, not just my clients. So thank
Yes.
you, Grace.
No, thank you. And I really am so interested in that experience for you because Like when you think, even though we joke that there's maybe some push towards law, you do clearly thrive and love what
Yeah.
you do and you're making this
Uh-huh.
impact. But then you
Don't
also,
that's my mum because her head'll grow. She'll be like, I told you so.
it is though where you remind yourself, and this is why it's so fun having you on the podcast, because not only the topics we're discussing, someone like female lawyer, great, but also sport is, it really is turning, but predominantly it is a male, like
Yes.
prioritized sport industry. And I remember
Yeah.
telling you, like, even when I first turned up to my college in the States, it was the first time ever that the female athletes in the rowing sense were put above male athletes in terms
Yeah.
of, oh, you know, first use of boats, first use of docks. And I was like, kind of shocked that that felt so unnatural. And
Hmm.
I was like, oh, or that we were going at the same time. I was kind of used to, okay, well, the guys are going to get first dibs. And that's no,
Yeah.
we're not here to say like that's good or bad. Like, well, it's better that it's progressing, but I'm not here to take a dig at the
Hmm.
male sport. What I'm
Hmm.
wanting to call out is like you being such a leader in the sports and entertainment, like legal sector, is really cool and inspiring for anyone, but also other females who are like, I can be a boxing lawyer, like that's even a thing that I can
Yeah.
that I can do.
I
Like,
didn't know it was a thing.
yeah, and now you're doing it, and then people can
Uh,
listen to this or see you. And so one of the main questions that I actually need to ask,
yeah.
because this is Tall Poppy Talk, and it's all about people like yourself who are tall poppies, who are kind of doing something that maybe is definitely putting yourself out there or growing in a way that's a bit, you know, unconventional or
Yeah.
hasn't necessarily been done before. And so I wanted to know, firstly, if you've heard of it before, but if you could describe tall poppy syndrome in your own words, no right or wrong answer,
Hmm.
and then how you feel like you've experienced and also witnessed it.
Yeah. So I would say that tall poppy syndrome is when people try and cut down or criticize those who might stand out or might achieve success, often because of their own insecurities or jealousy or their own sort of discomfort with their ambition and
Yeah.
creating their own success. I think that's probably how I describe it. And to your second question, sadly, yes, I've witnessed it and experienced it. Especially, as you just mentioned then, especially as a woman in very male dominated spaces, like the legal industry as a whole, be the sports and entertainment industry, as like a sort of sector, and see, boxing, which is the sport that takes up approximately like 80% of my time. But I've realized in like the last couple of years or so that um success can sometimes invite scrutiny or subtle undermining, I would say, for want of better words. Yeah, it's subtle undermining, I'll go with that. And I've kind of learnt to expect it, which is sad, but at the same time, not let it define me. And I think the key is to, surround yourself with people, who want to see you grow, and to, get rid of anyone and anything that doesn't bring you joy, who doesn't support you in what you're trying to achieve, and to not apologize for your ambition and to keep hustling and to be the best that you can be.
I love that, that not apologize for your ambition. That right
Why
there.
why are we apologizing? It's 2025. Like, absolutely not. You can achieve anything that you set your mind to. You absolutely can. And I 100% believe in that. So if anybody or anything is in your way of that, get rid, put in the trash.
Do
That's all
you,
I've got to say.
I was gonna say, do you think like being around these boxes all the time is maybe helping you bolster that mentality? Because they have to, like, they're going into a ring to fight someone. They have to
Uh-huh.
be like, you don't like me or you don't necessarily support me, but I'm going to put myself out there. Like, that has to rub off back on you, like some reverse, good exposure there.
Yeah, I think so. I think just working with athletes sort of generally, they're, so good at, zoning in and, focusing on, what they want to achieve, whether that's to go to the Olympics or, be a world champion or play in a Premier League football team. Like, I think I've always been very disciplined, and that's part of growing up in the household that I did, and from doing sport from like the age of like 3 years old, which is crazy. You do learn to have that discipline. So I think it's definitely a mix of both nature and nurture.
So cool. And one story that we had shared that I would love to get on the podcast too is not even a story so much as just like an experience, because I've become more interested in UFC boxing. It still
Yeah.
scares me. Like I watch and I'm like, ugh, stop it.
You know
Like,
what? Sometimes, I mean, I've been to countless shows now, but sometimes I will sit there and I'm like, I don't think I can watch any more of this.
no, I actually, there are times I'm like, please stop, even though that's what they're doing. But we had spoken about, and I'd love for you to share, of like you have these athletes who are in an intense camp for months, and then what happens the week of the fight, and then where that leaves them afterwards, especially if they've won or lost. So could you just talk through that experience for, let's say, boxer in the sense of pre, during, and post a match?
Yeah, 100%. And again, like every fighter is different. They react to different situations very differently. But I think generally, it's it's fair to say that a camp, so this is pre-fight now, can be a lonely place. You've got some fighters who will go into camp for maybe 12 weeks, 10 weeks. They might go to a different country to train with their team, and they don't have their friends around them, they don't have their family around them. It's literally Groundhog Day. You're in the gym in the morning, you're going for a run in the afternoon, and you're doing the same thing over and over again. And the only thing that really changes will be your sparring partners, or the weather. So that's pre-camp, so very lonely. But I guess that's kind of also where you really start to lock in and get your focus in. And then you've got fight week. So this is like sort of the calendar week in the lead up to the fight, which is usually on a Saturday night. And during that week, you've got a lot of press activity. You've got a public workout, you've got a press conference, you've got your like ceremonial weigh-in, you've got countless interviews, you're around your friends again, you're around your family again, everybody's really excited for the fight that's coming up on the Saturday. So in comparison to camp, that's a huge shift. And for an athlete's, mindset, it's really important for them to think, okay, these are all like promotional duties. This is part of my job. So I'm going to treat it like a job, and I'm not going to have fun with it. And I'm going to try and limit my exposure, my interaction with other people, so I can stay somewhat focused.
Yeah.
Because like the transition is just crazy. And then you've got fight night, which is obviously, emotions are running high, adrenaline's up here and down here. And again, every fighter treats fight night very differently. And depending on the outcome of a fight, you can have a very different, reaction. But again, you're sort of like, you're either at the highest high or you're at the, the lowest low. And then Sunday comes around, you sort of seeing your friends and family again, people are saying well done or condolences, or, you've still got a lot of interaction. And then after the week, like post week, after the fight, it kind of dies off. And, if you don't have another fight lined up, you'll go back into that really lonely place because, all the excitement has worn off. And, if you don't capitalize it on that, then you don't really, have much to do. And, like I said before, it's very much a roller coaster. It's very up and down, emotionally, and it can be super, super draining. That's sort of a whistle stop tour to, how a fight, how a fight works and what a fighter's mindset could be like.
Right. And one reason I asked you that, so thank you, is also to show like none of that was to do with the legal part, but you knew that, their emotions,
Yeah,
how that goes. And that just
yeah,
shows, although your title, for lack of a better word, is sports and entertainment lawyer, associate, all these things, the
mhm,
fact that you now know, even just within the boxing realm, how that journey goes and the emotions they're feeling and when their family's going to turn up and what happens after, shows the layers that exist within your role, because
Yeah.
it's not just what it looks like on the outside. You're with them during that journey, and like you said, you're a bit of a confidant
Either
as
one.
well, right? And you're talking with them, and maybe during
Yeah.
the press conference they say something, you're like, why did you say that? Or,
Yeah. I've
or
had that a
don't,
few times.
yeah, please don't say that, because I cannot imagine, especially post fight, having a camera in my face if I've won or if I've lost in particular, and having any sense of grace, excuse the pun, of being like, oh, that was a great fair fight, blah, blah, blah. Like, you're so hyped up on all the endorphins that are pumping through your body that you could just say anything. So,
Yeah.
and you're there watching, being like, all right, keep it together.
Yeah, that is exactly it. Yeah, you're just constantly on standby, I guess. And I think like our fighters now want us to, be present just in case, something were to go wrong. And they kind of see us as a bit of a security blanket. But yeah, I'm totally fine with that.
Definitely, because it's not just the big broadcasting cameras, it's people's phones.
Yeah.
And you think about that, like how often there are cameras on athletes.
Yeah.
If you had a camera on me, that often I would probably say some things that could be misunderstood, Like, I would also be like, did you get that? Like, it's just such a complex environment, and I'm very curious for you how it's going to evolve over the years when more technology comes out,
Yeah,
or
100%.
maybe fights start to look different because of X, Y, and Z,
Yeah.
and your niche and understanding will just grow.
Yeah, I'm hoping so. I mean, we've seen boxing like totally change over the past like 2, 3 years already. We've had a lot of investment from, the Middle East, and I think that has sort of changed, fighters' perspectives on what they should be paid, and also, the existing promoters, how they should be paying and treating their own fighters in their own stables. So it is really interesting. Boxing just generally as a sport moves so quickly. We could agree a deal in principle like at 9 a.m. in the morning, and by 5 p.m. that deal will be off the table, or like the terms will have materially changed. So it is very much a moving feat, but that's what makes it super exciting, super creative as well, which I really enjoy. So yeah, I'm quite excited to see how it's going to continue to evolve, like over the next however long I continue being a lawyer.
Me too. Now, Ange, our final sign-off question. Well,
Yes.
before I ask that, actually, is there anything I didn't ask you, or something we didn't talk about that you think I should have during this interview?
I don't think so. I think we've had a really good chat. Just generally about, athlete welfare and, some things that they, should look out for. But obviously if anybody is an athlete listening or watching, feel free to get in touch. But no, I think we've covered like quite a few interesting topics. I think, one thing I mentioned earlier is, whether you're an athlete or an artist, talent, whatever, protect your value early and don't wait until, there's a crisis to get the right team around you. And if you're somebody breaking into this field, back yourself, even if the path feels untraditional, the door doesn't have to be wide open for you to push it, basically.
Done. Mic drop right there. Thank you. Thank you. It doesn't have to be open, but you can push it open.
Yeah, you can.
I resonate with that. To completely switch things, my sign-off question is just to give another round out of who you are as a person. If you had to listen to just one musical artist for the rest of your life, who's it going to be?
50 Cent.
Was not expecting that.
50 Cent in all circumstances, in all situations. He is actually on my target list to get in as a client. So 50 Cent, if you're listening.
He's a regular.
Yeah, please reach out. He, his story is just incredible. But also like his music is just amazing, and there is actually a track for every single circumstance you could find yourself in. So yeah, I would go for 50 Cent.
Okay, listen, 50 Cent. Everyone's gonna go listen and be like, all right, let's go listen to
I did
50
not
Cent now.
expect that from her.
But that is why we love it. And honestly, the second quality conversation I've had the pleasure of having with you, this time with a mic involved and other people get to listen.
You.
But thank you so much for giving your time, which is very valuable, to be on Tall Poppy Talk today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to Tall Poppy Talk. We'll see you next time. Feel free to check us out on socials, YouTube, and the website. Thanks for today's guest, and we'll see you all next time. Take care.